So in our first 3 parts, we talked about how dragon riding and dragon hatching may be an X-chromosome-linked gene that follows basic Mendelian genetics. If it does, it explains a lot about the Wars of Westeros, the Faith of the Seven, and the actions of the mysterious Bloodraven. After all, Bloodraven seems to have manipulated Targaryen succession to put Egg on the throne, and the reasoning may be Egg's genes. Which brings us to the rebirth of dragons, and Daenerys. Now depending on your beliefs, this may be the end of the series for you. Egg would certainly pass his Dragon X gene to his daughter, Shaera, and there's a 25% chance that her children, Aerys and Rhaella, would both receive the Dragon X gene. And then there's a 50% chance that Daenerys would become Double Dragon X and be a dragon hatcher. That is, if you think Daenerys is actually the child of Aerys and Rhaella. Of course, if you're a fan of my videos, you know that I don't think Daenerys is the child of Aerys and Rhaella. The fact that there are no lemon trees in Braavos makes me question what we know about Daenerys' childhood. The fact that Ned was obsessed with Dany makes me think he had a connection to her. And the fact that Eddard had growing guilt over Lyanna makes me think that something going on in the Eddard story was affecting it. But there's also the actions of Rhaegar. So let's go back and try to figure out what Rhaegar was up to. We know that early on, Rhaegar was obsessed with prophecy. Of course, he wasn't the only one. The first Targaryen we hear about obsessing over prophecy was Aerys I. It was Aerys that found a prophecy that said dragons would return. Aerys, of course, is the same king that made Bloodraven hand, and shunned his wife for some reason. And it was common belief that Aerys was controlled by Bloodraven. So I suspect that it was Bloodraven that gave Aerys this book on prophecies. Dragon dreams then began to haunt the Targaryens. Egg's brother Daeron the Drunken dreamed of dragons returning, as did Daemon Blackfyre II. And of course we know that Bloodraven has the means to send dreams. These dreams and prophecies seemed quite effective in influencing Targaryens. Egg and all of his brothers were quite convinced that dragons would return. As I said, Egg's brother Daeron dreamed it, Egg's brother Aemon researched it in depth, Egg's brother Aerion lit himself aflame hoping to transform himself into a dragon, and Egg himself had Summerhall. And I suspect that Egg's entire reason for marrying Betha Blackwood, Bloodraven's skin-changing house, was in hopes of dragons returning. This obsession continued on into Egg's children. Egg's son Jaehaerys took advice from the Ghost of High Heart to marry his children to each other, and I suspect his own incestuous marriage was due to her advice as well. And the obsession passed another generation to Jaehaerys' son, Aerys II. He believed if King's Landing became a burning inferno, he would be transformed into a dragon. Which brings us to Rhaegar. So Rhaegar's dad, granddad, and great-granddad all believed in the prophetic return of dragons. So it's no wonder that Rhaegar was obsessed with it as well. He wrote Maester Aemon about it, he hung out at Summerhall, and he completely changed the direction of his life over it. Now considering that Rhaegar's ancestors believed that breeding with the right woman would fulfill prophecy, it stands to reason that Rhaegar's choice in mates would be along these same lines. And so Rhaegar ended up marrying Elia Martell. Now Rhaegar certainly didn't marry Elia for love, and it was a very dumb move politically as it alienated the Lannisters. No, Rhaegar's marriage to Elia seemed to be related to her lineage. After all, Elia Martell could be carrying a Dragon X gene from her ancestor, Dornish Daenerys. If Elia and Rhaegar each had a Dragon X gene, there's a 50% chance that their child Aegon would be a dragon rider, and there's a 50% chance that their daughter Rhaenys would be a dragon hatcher. Of course, we don't actually know Rhaenys' abilities as she was killed, and who knows if Aegon is actually young Griff. So Elia grows weak and is unable to have any more children. Or at least, that's what the Maesters said. However, Rhaegar is convinced that he needs 3 children, not 2. He had Rhaenys, he had Aegon. It would stand to reason that he expected to have another daughter, one named Visenya. And Daenerys mentions the fact that Visenya is missing. So if Elia can't produce a 3rd child, what is Rhaegar supposed to do? Well, around the time of Aegon's birth, Rhaegar ends up attending the tourney at Harrenhal. And at that tourney, he ends up observing an unusual occurrence. A small mystery knight called the Knight of the Laughing Tree defeats several jousters and then disappears. Rhaegar is tasked with finding the knight. Now it's almost certain that the Knight of the Laughing Tree was a Stark. They were the ones that knew about the bullying of Howland Reed at the Harrenhal tourney, and Jojen is quite surprised that Bran has never been told the story. The size of the knight really narrows down the suspects to either Lyanna or Benjen. Rhaegar would find the Knight of the Laughing Tree, unmask the knight, and then be baffled. How could such a young boy or girl be such an incredible jouster? I've always been a great horse rider, the knight would respond. When I ride, it's like I'm one with the horse. Now at this point, Rhaegar's mind would probably go to Bloodraven and House Blackwood. The Knight of the Laughing Tree would be describing skin changing, and he would be holding a sigil very close to House Blackwood, and Rhaegar would remember that House Blackwood is the skin changing house of Bloodraven. And Rhaegar would remember that Egg's wife was a Blackwood, and that they died at Summerhall trying to hatch dragons. And Rhaegar would remember that Aegon the Unworthy started a civil war because he wanted to have children with Blackwoods and Brackens. It would dawn on Rhaegar that the gene that Aegon the Unworthy and Egg were searching for was in House Stark. Lyanna's skin-changing gene could be a proxy for the Dragon X gene, and together they could produce a Dragon Hatcher. Now you may be wondering where Lyanna got her skin-changing gene from. Well, if we assume that skin-changing is also an X-chromosome-linked gene, and we note that Brandon was also an incredible horse rider, we can figure out that they must have inherited their gene from their mother, Lyanna Stark. And before that, either from House Flint or House Royce. It's hard to say, but my money is on House Flint. Old Nan said that Bran inherited his love of climbing from his grandmother of House Flint. Of course, living in the mountains doesn't really make you a great climber. It makes you a great hiker, or maybe a great mountaineer, but there's no real reason why they would be great climbers. That is, unless they're climbing over the wall. It could be that the Flints commonly climb the wall in order to trade with the wildlings, and from an intermarriage they could have got a skin-changing gene. So Rhaegar's initial pursuit of Lyanna was not because she was hot, and it wasn't because she had a great personality, and it wasn't destiny either. Lyanna had the right type of genes. The prince that was promised can awaken dragons from stone because of science, or at least science fiction. And all the prophecies and dragon dreams are likely just Bloodraven nudging people in the right direction to get what he wants. Now you may be wondering why a skin-changing gene would proxy for a dragon-riding gene. Well, I suspect that these are generally just telepathy genes, and that these genes are versatile. Lyanna and Arya are naturally good horse riders thanks to skin changing. And yet so is Daenerys thanks to her dragon genes. We know Bloodraven is a skin changer, and yet he can also change his appearance, something Arya is now being trained to do. Sansa likely had the potential to be a skin changer, but instead uses her powers to influence men. Having strong legs can make you a great runner or a great jumper. Having telepathy can make you a great skin changer or a great dragon rider. So what about some other characters? Can they be dragon riders too? Well, Jon Snow's mother might be a Shara Dane, a family with Valyrian features that may have a Dragon X gene. Or his mother may be Lyanna Stark, and he may have inherited from her a skin-changing gene. Either mother would explain why Jon is a telepath. So what about Stannis? Well, despite having Targaryen roots through his father, Stannis' mother was Cassana Estermont, and we have no reason to believe that she was a telepath. And what about Jaime, Cersei, and Tyrion? Well, there is one small thing that gives me pause. Currently there are 3 stories involving Dunk and Egg. The Hedge Knight, the Sworn Sword, and the Mystery Knight. The Hedge Knight has royalty fighting royalty, and ends with a major shakeup in Targaryen succession. The Mystery Knight involves a conspiracy and a second Blackfyre rebellion. The scope and impact of these 2 stories are huge. But the scope of the second story, the Sworn Sword, is small. It involves a land dispute between 2 minor houses, and the marriage of a rather unimportant lady named Rohan Weber. Perhaps she's a no-one, but then again, our author loves redheads. He's married to one, and redheads like Danelle Lawston and Sansa have special powers. I bring all this up because if Rohan Weber were special, she could pass on her specialness to her son, Jason Lannister. And Jason would in turn pass his specialness on to Joanna Lannister, which may explain why Tywin and King Aerys were both so infatuated with her. And there's a chance that Joanna could pass on her gene to any of her children. So while the Sworn Sword may just be a fun little irrelevant tale, there's a possibility that it has a huge impact. And we made it, 400 years of Targaryen history, which brings us to the end of our series. Mendelian genetics was introduced in a Game of Thrones with Eddard's sleuthing, and genetic engineering is a major aspect of our author's other works. Not to mention, Mendelian genetics is something that explains dwarfism, albinism, webbed fingers, and other conspicuous traits that appear in A Song of Ice and Fire. Of course, it's possible that dragon riding is connected to a non-sex-related chromosome. However, an X-linked matrilineal balance to the patriarchy of Westeros is fitting and aligns with our author's general feminist message. Not to mention, the royal disease of hemophilia was X-linked. Once again, I'm probably wrong about half of this. And my next series, by overwhelming vote from my Patreon supporters, is Faceless Men.